This is Knowledge Engineering with Semantic Web Technologies, lecture number 5, Ontological Engineering. And today we want to talk about ontology design methodologies. Okay, so from the last part of the lecture we already remember that it's useful to follow a specific strategy, a methodology for the ontology development process. Especially if you want to save costs, especially if you are developing within a team that is distributed over several locations, and if you want to guarantee the correctness of your developed ontology. Usually for ontology design, you see here several activities are involved, and we have already talked about that, and today we want to focus on the middle part, which are the development-oriented methods. And one of the most prominent methods, of course, it's only a toy example here, it's the so-called Ontology Development one-on-one, which has been developed by Natasha Noy and Deborah McGinnis in 2000. And what they do is they propose an ontology, so it's the wine and food ontology, which is about specific wine growing regions in France and, for example, in California, and it should answer questions like, so which kind of wine fits to which kind of dish. And for that, they are following a special methodology. And the methodology they propose, you see here in a sketch, of course, there are several stages within that kind of methodology, but it's an iterative process that repeats continuously and tries always to improve the ontology. So it means it's not only straightforward, but you can step back and refine in every place that you are inside that cycle of the ontology development. Of course, there are always different approaches for modeling the ontology, and in practice, usually your application that you have in mind decides on which way or which path to follow which in that kind of development cycle for your ontology. Keep in mind, there is no one correct way to model a domain ontology or to model a domain. There are always viable alternatives, and somebody else might model the domain in a complete different way. This always depends on what knowledge exact you need for your application that you have in mind for the ontology you develop here. So you have to keep this in mind in the end. The entire process consists of the following stages. First, we have to determine the scope of the ontology. We have to consider possible reuse. Then we start with the enumeration of important terms. We define classes, we define properties, we define constraints, and then we create instances. It's as easy as that. So this already is a methodology. Okay, let's start with the first point. We determine the domain and the focus. So first we have to answer questions, which domain should be covered by the ontology that we develop. For the wine ontology, it's clear wine should somehow be explained, and possibly also food should be explained. So what kind of dishes are there? And of course, there should be knowledge like what kind of wine fits to which kind of dish. So the question is, what should the ontology be used for? So for example, you should be able to answer questions, and of course, which type of questions should be answered by the knowledge represented in the ontology, and who will use and maintain the ontology. So these are questions that have to be determined in the beginning. So there you determine the domain and the focus. And one very important step is the so-called formulation of competence questions. What are competence questions? They, of course, they cover all the knowledge or questions that should be answered with the help of the knowledge that is inside, that will be then later on stored in your ontology. So for the wine ontology, this could be questions like, for example, which properties of the wine should be considered for modeling? So is Bordeaux a white wine, or is this a red wine, or does this question somehow make sense? Does a Sauvignon Blanc match with fish? Which wine matches best for grilled vegetables, and so on and so on. So this is a collection of questions which should be able to answer with the knowledge you put inside your ontology. So the structure of the ontology, the structure of your domain should reflect every knowledge which is possible or which is necessary to answer exactly these questions. Okay, please keep in mind that, of course, If you now come up with a question, you can design your ontology after that. But of course, in the course of the ontology development, these questions might change within this ontology life cycle. So you have to keep in mind that the process, of course, can go a step back, formulate new questions, then start again to formulate new classes and stuff that is related to that. So therefore, we have some kind of cycles to take into account. So next, when we have considered the scope, then we have to think about possible reuse. Why should we consider reuse? Of course, simply to save costs. Things we can reuse, we do not have to develop again. So we do not have to reinvent the wheel again. The other thing is also we should use other ontologies that have already been developed simply to apply tools that have been applied for other existing ontologies. And we should apply them also to our own ontology. And therefore also, for example, we can reuse ontologies that have already been validated by other kind of applications. So the validation process in the end could also be saved. So this is a safe thing also, always to keep in mind which kind of ontologies do exist for my domain. Can I possibly reuse them? Do I have to adapt them? So these are questions which have to be answered before I start really then developing a completely new ontology. So the point then is, if you don't find a suitable ontology, or if the adaptation of this existing ontology might be too complex, too cost intensive, then create a new ontology. So we start creating a new ontology, and the first step we do there is somehow, of course, we have to explore the domain we are talking about. So somehow we have to find all the terms and the concepts we are talking about. What kind of properties do these concepts have? What do we want to say about these concepts? So for example, for the wine ontology, some of the major concepts we want to have in the ontology are wine, grape, winery, location. We want to know about a wine's body, its flavor, its color, its sugar content, and all the stuff. And we also should take into account that, of course, there is white wine, there is red wine, there is wine from specific regions, and the same also for food. There are specific types of food. There is vegetables, there is cheese, there is beef, and all the stuff like that. So these are things we have to gather here and we have to collect, and this, of course, is then called the development of a so-called terminology. So terminology development, very important step. This is sometimes also then connected to the process of knowledge extraction. So I have to ask possibly an expert in wine, an expert in food and dishes and preparing dishes, and they have to put their knowledge in the way that, first of all, we try to find what are the important concepts, the important terms, and how do they interact within the domain that I am considering. So this is the first step, development of a terminology. Then I start with the development of classes and class hierarchies. So I try somehow to sum up things which have similar properties. So classes are collections of objects with similar properties. And for example, in our wine ontology, we would have the class of wines, the class of wineries, or the class of red wines. And we can also design a hierarchy that we say, okay, red wines, of course, are a specialization of wine. So therefore, wine is a superclass of red wine and stuff like that. And you can follow by constructing these class hierarchies, you can follow their several approaches. So the most simple thing is to follow a top-down or button-up approach, and there is also something which is called a middle-out approach, and I will show you how these approaches really work. Let's start with a top-down approach. Like the term says, we start at the top and go down to the button. At the top, of course, there's the most generic concept, and if I want to create, let's say, an ontology about wine, then we can say, okay, wine, it's kind of a beverage, and we have to distinguish that there are, for example, alcoholic beverages and non-alcoholic beverages. And considering wine, of course, it's an alcoholic beverage. Another alternative alcoholic beverage, which is not wine, would be beer. And then, of course, wine can be somehow distinguished in white wine, red wine, rosé wine, and stuff like that. So this would be a top-down approach. I can also start my formalization and my class hierarchy development at the button. For example, I could say, okay, so the most specific things I want to consider are, for example, a Bordeaux red wine, a Bordeaux white wine, a Merlot red wine, a Chardonnay white wine. So these are the most specific things. And now I start growing this ontology to the top. So I try to summarize things that belong together. So on the left-hand side, for example, I have the white wines. On the right-hand side, I have the red wines. And of course, both of them are wine, and of course, wine is an alcoholic beverage. So this would be an example how to design an ontology hierarchy, a class hierarchy in a so-called bottom-up approach. And as you see here, of course, the approach that I chose in the end guides also the structure that has been developed out of my ontology. So for example, if I start with the most specific things, I might, for example, end not at the most abstract concept, like, for example, what is a beverage, or even further, because I don't need it for my application, so I can stop there. On the other hand, also, you might have more details here in the bottom-up approach if you first think of your most detailed things that you want to address. So both approaches sometimes, or most times, lead to different results in the resulting ontology. And then there is also the so-called middle-out approach. There you start with the most important concepts for your class hierarchy, according to the application you have in mind. And possibly you say, okay, for my wine application, the most important concepts would be red wine, Bordeaux wine, and white wine. Okay, and then you simply start, for example, to gather things together and say, okay, all of these are wines, so therefore wine would be a superclass of these three. And then you can also go in the other direction and say, okay, I define some white wines, which would be the Merlot white wine and the Bordeaux red wine. And then I do white wines, the Bordeaux and the Chardonnay, and I can also then subsume the Bordeaux wines here. And of course, wine is an alcoholic beverage. And again, starting with this middle-out approach, also my structure might end up in something which is not like the other two approaches. It always depends on the way how you want to define your ontology, or what is the application in mind, where's the emphasis of your approach and of your intention, which of these approaches you choose. All of them have their drawbacks and all of them have their benefits. So you have to choose which one to use. And most times, or many times, you are on the safe side if you, for example, first consider what are the most important concepts and start with a so-called middle-out approach. Okay, now we have classes and the class hierarchy. The next thing is, of course, we have to say how these classes are connected to each other. And for this, we have to define the properties. So the properties in a class definition describe attributes of instances. Like, for example, every wine has a color, every wine has residual sugar, every wine has a producer, and so on. So these are the properties. And you see here also the window in the Protégé tool in which properties can be defined. So they connect either they connect single individuals which belong to classes, or they connect a class individual to a specific value. So these are then data type properties. So you define here object properties and data type properties. And the next step then would be to define also constraints for the properties. So, of course, domain and range of a property should be restricted. Like, for example, the name of a wine is a string, the producer of a wine is the instance of a winemaker. So you do domain and range restrictions and further restrictions depending on which complexity the description language you choose, for example, OWL or, for example, RDFS, really offers you to make these kind of restrictions. And, of course, what is your application? So what restrictions, what complexity in expressivity do you really need here to define these kind of constraints? And after you have defined your classes, your properties, and your property constraints, you populate your ontology with instances, so with individuals. You create instances for the classes, and then of course every class directly becomes the type of its instance. Every superclass of a direct type also then is also a type of this instance. And of course you also create instances for properties. So you assign property values, or you assign which kind of individuals are connected by a given property. For the wine ontology, you would then, for example, define facts like this is the glass of wine that I drank for last supper, for example. So this is a specific instance of a glass of wine. Okay, and then usually you are ready, but keep in mind things are changing. Your application is possibly changing. Also, the kind of available wines is changing. So therefore, you have to go back. You have possibly to define new classes. You have to change your class hierarchy. You have to change your constraints and stuff like that. So therefore, this is kind of an iterative process that repeats continuously to improve and to adapt the ontology. One thing is missing here, which is for example, the definition of rules, which is not possible here. So therefore, sometimes this development methodology is not considered a fully fledged ontology development methodology. For this course, this will be all the methodologies we will talk about. In the extra part of the course, only on a voluntary and optional basis, I will also talk about a few other methodologies which are then really used in practice and in professional use cases. Okay, but so much for ontology development. In the next part of the lecture, we want to talk about another activity of ontological engineering, and this then will be ontology learning.